So good morning all, lovely to see you here. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Belinda Cay and I'll be your MC for the day. I farm down at Pinery. I'm a Director of AgCommunicators and have a background in plant science, but talked too much to be a scientist. So I've worked in science communication and science strategy planning for the last 24 years or so. My job today is to keep everyone to time, introduce the speakers and generally keep the day in order. And I have to say I'm tremendously excited to be here, and it's great to see so many people here today to participate in best practice spray application discussion. So before I go further, I just would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So today, it's going to be awesome. We've got a great range of speakers on the agenda, and the forum is going to cover topics such as social licence, droplets and nozzles, market access, weather monitoring, optimising spray effectiveness, policy, hazardous inversions, weather stations and broom spray, and more. GPSA are really pleased to be bringing everyone together today to talk about a priority issue for GPSA and the wider agricultural community. And today there's going to be a lot of great discussion and idea sharing, and then the workshop really is going to step us forward and having some panel sessions so we can ask questions and really engage with our speakers. Now, before I get into the day, I have a few bits of housekeeping and a few ground rules for the day. Now, first of all, toilets, they are out this door and down the corridor. Emergency exits, just in case you head out our door here and we meet out on the oval or the car park. Now, I ask you to please keep your phones on silent. So I know we're in a very technology world, but please try and engage throughout the day. Switch the phones on silent so then we can, not distract the speakers. Thank you very much. Now, the other thing is we have coffees via the barista throughout the day, so we're going to keep you caffeinated. We recognise it's a really long day, so we've got the coffees on tap, ready to go. The other thing we've got is some awesome trade stalls over here, so throughout the day, pop on over, say hello and see what they've got to offer. I'd also like to just do a quick shout out to GPSA for putting on the day. Can you give them a round of applause? Look how many people we've got together. So throughout the day, we've got CEO Brad Perry. Where are you, Brad? Oh, he's getting coffee. We've got Chair John Gladigau down here, Director Nick Hillier, and we've also got GPSA Chair Professor Simon Maddox here as well. Simon, where are you? Getting coffee as well, good. So the team's all engaged and ready to go. But I think that's awesome. We've built in really long lunch breaks throughout the day, and that's done for a reason, so you can come and ask questions and have the discussions that you need to have. Just a few other bits of housekeeping. Now, this one, I'm sure you're going to laugh at me because it is only 8:35 in the morning. There is water up here in the fridge, but you'll note there's beer in there as well, and the organisers have said a friendly reminder that the beer's for afternoon tea only, not for morning tea and lunch. So just a reminder there. And then I'm told that I need to give you a friendly reminder that you are drinking responsibly at the networking because we want you to all get home safely to your families. So there's my, you've heard it here, folks, there's my work health and safety reminder for the morning. Other things, it is a public forum today, so we have got representatives from the media here, we've got a video crew and photographer, so if you don't want to be in any photos, then please just put your hand up and say, not keen to be in a shot. The other thing I'd like you to do today is make friends at your table. So I can see a lot of friends here already, but what I'd like you to do now is just pause for a second. I've popped some post-it notes on the table. Just want you to have a quiet moment and reflect on something new that you're wanting to learn today, or perhaps a question you'd like to answer. And at morning tea, I'm going to come around, grab the post-it notes with some of those questions on, and I'm going to put them to the speakers at the breaks and make sure that we get those questions covered in the presentations or in the panel session. So I've set my timer here. I'm giving you 2 minutes. Have a chat at your table. There's some pens, there's some post-it notes. If there's a burning question, I want you to write it down, please. And while you're doing it, if you don't know someone at the table, say hello to them. Introduce yourself. Right, you've got 2 minutes. All right, that's your 2 minutes, team. We'll get your Pens down and face the front. Oh, I sound like a teacher. I did want to be a teacher for a while. That's awesome. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to come round, as I said, grab those questions and make sure our speakers have them in hand, ready to go. A few other ground rules before we get started for the day. So I'm going to keep our speakers to time. I set my little timer up the front, so if you see me with my phone out, I'm not Googling the Kardashians. I'm keeping time and keeping things to order. I'm going to cut things off if we hit our time, so I'll open up for questions, but if we're going to go over, I'm going to hold the questions there. You've got pens and notepads at your table, so if you didn't get time to answer a question, we've got the panel sessions at the end where you can ask a question, or you can go up to the speaker and have a chat in those extended breaks that we've built in for you. My other rule of the day is to be kind. So at events like today where we've got topics that can be emotive, we are going to be having some tough conversations. We're going to have a lot of conversation, but I'm stating very clearly up front that we need to treat each other today with kindness and respect. Now, you might look and think I look quite nice, but I actually did go to a pretty dodgy high school, so I have a few what we call life skills, and I'm not afraid to use them. So I am setting that bar up front. I really want today to be a positive discussion. Yes, we're going to have hard conversations, but a reminder that we really need to treat each other with respect and acknowledge that everybody is here today to learn new skills, to have the conversations and to walk away being the best practice operators we can be. So that's my little ground rule for the day, and I look forward to our awesome discussion, our great participation, and to working with you throughout what is a great forum. So thank you again to GPSA for putting on a great day. And I think we should get started now. You've heard from me. I've given you my ground rules. I'm very bossy, but here's a little joke. So I actually was hosting a workshop. My husband's a soil scientist and I did punch well above my weight. Anyway, I was hosting this big conference. I had about 300 soil scientists in the room and I was all, come on everyone, we need to keep to time. Everyone sit down, we've got to get going. And this guy sat down up the back next to who he didn't realise was my husband. And he goes, my God, imagine being married to her. And my husband goes, yes, it would suck. Anyway, so he's very happy. I tell him that every day. No, anyway, there we go. So let's get started for the day. Our first session is from GPSA Chair John Gladigau, and it is looking at the state of play on spray. For those who haven't met John before, he's a third-generation farmer in the Northern Mallee region of SA and was a partner in Bullaburra. He's also the creative director at iFarmWell and works with a number of mental health initiatives across South Australia, including Vocal Locals. He's a 2007 Nuffield Scholar and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And today he is setting the scene, giving us the state of play on spray from GPSA. Make him welcome, John.
Thanks very much, Belinda. It's great to be here today, and thank you to all of you for making the effort to attend Grain Producers SA Forum today. And I know a lot of you have travelled a long way to be here, and in today's world our time is really valuable. So making the effort to be here is not only appreciated, but also it shows just how important that you rate the subject matter that we're looking to discuss. As Belinda mentioned, I'm the chair of Grain Producers South Australia. I've been a lifelong grain grower in the Northern Mallee region near Loxton, Allawuna, in the Riverland region, and I've been a director of GPSA for 3.5 years and the chair since last August. And in my time on the board, one of the number one issues constantly discussed around the board table has been in regards to chemical stewardship. In the way that we apply chemicals, the way that we educate farmers to use chemicals, how we measure the weather when we apply chemicals, how we mitigate off-target damage. And there certainly wouldn't be a grain farmer in South Australia who wouldn't be aware of the campaigns that we've been holding, the texts that we send, the media articles and the interviews that we've done, all with messaging around responsible chemical stewardship. So why are we needing to hold a spray forum? As they say during interventions, we have a problem. And that problem is that we are seeing an unacceptable level of off-target chemical damage across our state, especially in the vulnerable regions. In fact, some would say that despite our best efforts, the amount of damage is actually increasing rather than diminishing. And we need to work out why. And we need to make changes. And we need to do it before others make or put unacceptable changes on us. But to make it really clear, the vast majority of grain producers in South Australia apply chemicals safely and diligently and responsibly as per the label. The vast majority spray vigilantly within safe weather conditions to not only ensure that they maximise every drop of what is a very valuable and expensive crop input, but also to ensure that they're not sharing their product with others who definitely don't want it. But it's a small percentage that we have to work on changing. And how we do that is not only a conversation for the GPSA board, which we do often, but it's a conversation we're going to have here today, and it's a conversation that we need to have with every producer here in South Australia. Because the only way we're going to be able to change the practice of the farmers doing the wrong thing is if we as a grain producing community stand up and say, enough is enough. For today's forum, we've assembled some of the best speakers on spray application in Australia, and many of them are world renowned. In fact, Dr. Andrew Hewitt is joining us from Washington in the United States, where he's working on a project requiring his expertise. And through these sessions today, we hope that you're able to have a better understanding of the latest practices and the latest technologies in spraying and ask any burning questions. This is your forum. We need to work together to create the best outcome for all of us. Just recently, I was overseas on a holiday, not for work, but I got to meet many farmers, mainly in the UK, but also some in Europe, where compliance and heavy regulation is just part of everyday farming life. And the disconnection between farmers and the general public was frankly frightening to see. Here in Australia, we are still really fortunate to have generally a supportive public and to still have access to the key decision makers in government. But it hasn't been just luck that has got us to this. It is the hard work of advocacy groups like GPSA, PPSA and others that mean we enjoy some of the freedoms that we have today. Overseas, in the Northern Hemisphere, the idea of an industry creating their own harvest code of practice in which growers are invested, in which they look out for and call out each other when we step outside the line, is a completely foreign concept to them. For them, having access to chemicals, inputs and even markets, they don't. We just take those for granted. And for them, it's a source of envy, unrest, and in many cases pushed as a trade barrier. The open access that we have to those with political influence here in Australia on both sides of the fence is something that we probably don't actually value enough. But in saying that, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, spray drift. It's important that today that we discuss the opportunities and the challenges ahead of us when it comes to spraying, And while those conversations may be robust, they must be respectful and the outcomes must be focused. But the thing is that unlike our Northern Hemisphere counterparts, we are still in control of our own destiny. We as growers have the opportunity to ensure that we take ownership of a problem before others provide the answers for us. And as the peak advocacy body representing grain producers here in South Australia, we are looking at every possible opportunity to stop spray drift. We know that it not only impacts farmers, it also impacts communities. And that's why we've just recently commissioned a consultant to take a deep dive into this issue and provide options for GPSA going forward on areas that we can look to best encourage best practice spray application. This is an all-encompassing and wide-sweeping piece of work. We're also working with the University of South Australia to look at literature reviews and see if there are trends in worldwide historical agrochemical practices that can help us inform future policy into behaviour change. And I'm really pleased that we have Professor Kumar on the panel today, or on the program, talking more on this subject. So on that note, once again, thank you for supporting our forum today, and make sure that you leave today with more spray knowledge than when you left. But I hope you also leave with a renewed commitment to work together to create greater, responsible outcomes, not only for more profitable, productive and sustainable farms, but also for safer and stronger communities. As they say, knowledge is power. We are in control of our own destiny, and the future begins now. I'm really looking forward to today, and I hope you are too.
Thanks very much for those words, John. Excellent to hear what you've got in mind and the vision for GPSA. I'm going to hand straight into our second speaker. I'd now like to welcome GPSA Director Nick Hillier, who's going to talk about the Don't Spray Your Dollars Away campaign. Now, for those of you who haven't met Nick before, Nick has operated a mixed family farming business in the southeast for nearly 30 years. And I actually met someone before just earlier who said, you've been their agronomist for 30 years and they valued your advice. So that's a pretty cool endorsement. He has tertiary qualifications in agricultural science and his own independent consulting business. Let's make him welcome for Don't Spray Your Dollars Away campaign. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Belinda. Really great to see people here today. Welcome everybody to GPSA's day to talk about spray drift. It's great to see the grain producers, the agronomists, machinery resellers and the chemical suppliers. It's a really important day and an important issue to discuss spray drift. It's something we need to stop. We need to stop straight away. So we need to make sure we utilise this occasion well. As Belinda said, I farm in the southeast. We're in a little town called Hynham, just east of where the fire at Narracourt is at the moment. We also have a farm at Bordertown, so I farm from clade sands and 16-inch rainfall down to what we call the swamp country. We grow a wide range of crops. I've been a private consultant in agronomy for 30 odd years, as one of my clients reminded me. Can't quite see him here at the moment. Oh, there he is there, yeah. Poor man. I've been, as I said, an agronomist. I have a great passion, as a lot of you would know who have spoken to me, about spray drift. I think it's one of our biggest issues facing grain production in Australia, but we've got to knock it out. We've got to stop it. At GPSA, we've been working hard to look at the solutions to the challenges we face when it comes to applying agrochemicals. Internally, we've set up a spray drift working group, which I chair, and we've met several times last year and we've met once this year. This working group is made up of representatives from industry, farmers, consultants, PIRSA, academia, grain farmers. We've also got Cotton Australia on there because they have issues with spray drift up in northern New South Wales and Queensland. We also have Anna Baum from the Clare Valley Wine and Grape Association. Anna's somewhere there. There you go, Anna. So we've put this group together so that we can have a very open and frank discussion on spray drift. As I keep saying, we need to stop spray drift. It cannot go along anymore. Millions of dollars have been invested in education and awareness of spray drift. You know, GRDC, they've done that much research on it. It's all sitting there. And it's important for those doing the right thing to keep up to date with the latest technology and practice. You know, we all go out to different days and been educated in different ways. We need to update our skills. We really do. So the people doing the right thing, who think they're doing the right thing, then know they're doing the right thing. Okay? However, the focus has quickly turned to behavioural change. We've done a couple of things at GPSA. We put out the GPSA Spray Pledge. It was an initiative to raise the awareness and aim for behavioural change. Basically, we're trying to use peer pressure, that if you haven't taken the pledge to be a responsible sprayer, your neighbour gives you a nudge in the side and says, why haven't you done it? So we're trying to use that as a precursor to getting people to understand spray drift. We know that any single initiative won't fix the challenges we face in applying the chemicals, but we also know that we've reached a stage we can no longer sit on our hands. In addition to the work that John mentioned, appointing the consultant to look at the various options and the psychological study run by Professor Saravana Kumar, GPSA ran a campaign across multimedia channels this season. The campaign's catchphrase is "Don't spray your dollars away." And now we'll just hear a quick play from one of the radio ads.
Hey George, those weeds are out of control on your farm, mate. What's going on?
Yeah, I know. We've had heaps of trouble trying to spray them out. It just doesn't seem to be working.
Mate, you need to check the weather conditions before you spray. It's not a 9 to 5 application. You've got to do your homework, or you're just spraying dollars away.
Spray right or you'll pay the price. Authorised by Grain Producers SA.
Right, so there the ad's been running on multimedia processes, and we're trying to get the message out there to actually, understand what you're doing, and if a job doesn't work or you don't understand the technology, ask someone. So what this means to me, these ads, is to apply agrochemicals to industry best practice. The costs of getting it wrong are real. The costs of not applying agrochemicals correctly are, I call the localised costs. The dollar costs of the products we're applying. You would know all too well the cost of some of the chemicals you put on your paddocks. We've got to get it right. The time spent applying these products, you put them out in the paddock. If you're not doing it properly and not getting a satisfactory job, you're wasting your time. Then you look at the job after the spray's been applied, partially successful jobs. What do? Do you go back and respray? Do you go back and try and blame someone else? Potential drift issues with your surrounding crops. If we get out there and try and spray in conditions that aren't right for spraying, whether it's adverse inversions or whether it's wind in the wrong direction, we are putting at risk our crops and neighbours' crops and other people's crops. So we also have the potential under adverse conditions, adverse inversion conditions. You will hear that word said a few times today. See, Mick, I've said it, so you should be happy now. Hazardous inversions. The potential for the spray to move many, many kilometres under hazardous inversion conditions. If one thing comes out of this day today, please understand about hazardous inversions. If you don't understand it, talk to someone that does. We've got some really good experts here today. So we looked at the localised costs, the cost of this and doing the job. Then there's the big picture costs of spray drift. Residues exceeding MRLs in non-target crops. If you're spraying a product next door to a crop and you drift into his or her crop and they get picked up for residue, that becomes an issue. Market access. You hear those words, you see it in the media. We will lose market access if we have residue issues. We also potentially have the problem of loss of access to chemistry. You know, we've got some really good chemistry in farming at the moment. It's exciting, but even more exciting is the new chemistry that the companies can release to us. So if they're saying we're not having good stewardship of products, then companies will start saying, well, you know, do we need to release it into that market? It exposes them to too much risk. And as John said before, we have a good relationship with consumers, but today consumers drive the markets. They are wanting things that we have to produce. We have to produce chemical-free food, so we don't have that loss of consumer confidence. As an industry, we know the importance of getting agrochemical application right. We know there needs to be more understanding about hazardous inversions, and I'll keep emphasising that word. We know we need to stamp out spray drifters. That's simple. I don't ever run away from anything like this. My job's been in the private industry. When I recommend something, if they get drift, I get my rear end kicked too. We have a responsibility to not only ourselves, but to the other sectors of the agricultural community and the broader community to get spray application done properly. That's why GPSA today has brought together a really, really good list of speakers, some world-renowned academics and some really good extension people. So make use of the morning tea, lunch breaks, come up and introduce yourself to them. You'll see who they are during the day. Come up and meet me. I work for the grain farmers. I'm a director of GPSA, but I work for the farmers. So come up and meet me and have a bit of a chat. Anyway, that's my talk. I'll let the experts come on and look forward to the rest of the day.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thank you, John. Now, I've got Nick and John here from GPSA. We've got a few minutes. Any questions for the GPSA team about what they're up to, the structure of the day? Opening it up for questions. You got off lightly. Awesome. Well, let's give them I'll get you up in the break. As I said, if you've got any questions that you're not ready to ask yet, write them down. I'm going to grab them at morning tea, and we have those panel sessions for later on. Can we give them another round of applause? Thanks so much. And again, thank you very much to GPSA for putting on the day and taking this initiative. It's excellent to see. We're now going to move into our keynote presentation for the day. I'm really thrilled to welcome to the floor Professor Steve Powles, Emeritus Professor at the University of Western Australia. For those who haven't met Steve before, he's awesome, and I've had the pleasure of working with him over my career. Steve came from a small farm in New South Wales. He went to the Hawkesbury Ag College, where he studied agriculture, and he also did a Master's and PhD overseas. He then came back to the Waite Institute, where he started the Weeds and Herbicide program at the University of Adelaide. Here he was also a director for the CRC for Australian Reed Management, and he was then offered a job in Western Australia as the founding director of the Australian Herbicide Initiative. He sits on a range of scientific advisory boards, has 840 acres of cropping country, which he says keeps him grounded, and he's also an active volunteer. The list goes on with his resume. It's extremely impressive. We're thrilled to have you here today, Professor Powles. Please come up to the floor. Let's make him welcome.
Thank you, Belinda. Is that working okay? Can you hear me? Thank you for that introduction. I have to tell you, do you mind if I come down here? I like to see my audience. Ever since I taught undergraduate students at the Waite Institute, I'd walk amongst them, and if you're an undergraduate student at 8 o'clock in the morning and having a lecture and you feel like snoozing or something, there's nothing like standing beside a student like that. Or if you really want to get them, you wouldn't have slept, Belinda, would you? The best thing is, you know, if you're giving lectures, it's really depressing when you give student lectures if your students go to sleep. And so I learned most young Australians like sport, and you carry a tennis ball. And I don't have one with me today because you're all mature, unlike undergraduate students. And if somebody is nodding off, you throw them the tennis ball. And usually that'll keep them awake for the lecture. If they continue to sleep, you just throw it harder at the student. That works. So that's the first tip. It's really, can you hear me okay with this? It's really quite emotional for me to be back here in South Australia. I started, as Belinda said, at the Waite in the early 80s, and one of my first projects was on Gary Hanson's farm at Coomanduk, and I was on the Crop Science Society with Peter Grokey and others. So I've got a lot of history in South Australia, and so it's just great to be back again. Nick Hillier was an undergraduate student in those days, and I never had to throw the tennis ball to Nick Hillier. You know what a shy, retiring, skinny little fellow he is, and he was just very diligent as an undergraduate, and I'm sure that's absolutely continued throughout your life. So John, are you pleased to hear that? Yeah. That's how he is at the board table, so that's good. Now look, just picking up on the comments that are made, I am not going to be saying anything about spray drift, although I'm happy to, along with the other, and of course the other person I've mentioned is Chris Preston. So, I mean, one of the really good things that I did for South Australia was I left it, which enabled Chris Preston to be my successor. And of course you all know what a fantastic job Chris has done now for decades. Bravo to you, Chris. I'm going to talk about these subjects, and I'm assuming that most of you, and I know some of you, are broadacre farmers, but there may be some others here who are not. I'm mainly, the comments that I'm making are aimed at the broadacre grain growing farmers and answering what I think are the answers to these questions. Will we have herbicides or alternative technologies that are practical and cost effective in the next 10 to 15 years? So in the immediate life of all of us, or most of you at any rate, for the next 10 or 20 years. I'm not talking way out into the future. In fact, as you know, the further you get out into the future, the more likely you are to be wrong. I'm talking about the immediate future, now and the future. Will we have technologies to control weeds in broadacre? Now, this is serious stuff, as was mentioned. Now, there are some in the community, aren't there, who think we should stop herbicides, that it's got to stop, and they've got to stop now. There are others who think that there'll be no new herbicides, that all the ones that have been discovered have been discovered, and there are others in the community who think, well, we should just replace herbicides with alternatives to them. And I would like, just over the next 30 minutes, to address that from a practical farming, broadacre perspective in Australia. Remembering that, John, it is different to some other parts of the world, as you indicated. In Australia, we have the biggest family farms in the world, especially in Western Australia, but increasingly in South Australia. They are the biggest family farms in the world. And I often say to people, how would you like to hand weed 20,000 acres of country? And yet that is what some in the community would have us do. So let's address the first question, the first two questions here. Some think we should stop herbicides, and some think there'll be no new herbicides. Okay, so here's the first statement. I believe that for the next 20 years, we're going to be using herbicides in broadacre agriculture in Australia and in comparable other nations like Canada, United States, Brazil, Argentina, and the other great grain-producing regions. That may not be true for Europe, where the average farm size is 60 hectares, and which there are potent forces in the community which are anti. I believe we'll still use herbicides, but we must use them in a very responsible manner, and that'll be much of what today is about, I'm sure. Now let's just think about it for a minute. For all those who say we shouldn't use herbicides, every person in this room involved in agriculture knows that statement's true. It's not so easy to control weeds on big farms cost effectively in great big paddocks. We've got the biggest farming paddocks in the world. It's not so easy to do it. And herbicides do the job. They're not perfect. Resistance can evolve, spray drift can occur, there can be other issues. But what technology is perfect? A truck outside the front of a kindergarten is a substantial risk. So all sorts of technologies have upsides and downsides. But herbicides do the job in global grain crops. And let's just spend a moment thinking about whether we'll actually have new herbicides given all the complexities around the world. Well, new herbicides, I hope you can see that. Everything is up there is absolutely true. They have to be safe to people, animals and the environment. They have to be non-mutagenic, non-carcinogenic, non-toxic, etc., low drift, low volatilization. They have to be effective, they have to be consistent, that is, they work when it's 30 degrees and 3 degrees. They have to be easily applied, they have to be crop selective, and they have to be cheap. And if you want to discover such a chemical, they're going to be very rare. And that's why glyphosate is a 1 in 100 year discovery. That's why it takes 100 years for a chemical like glyphosate to come along. Glyphosate is simply the world's greatest herbicide. It's like penicillin. It's only discovered every now and again. It's a huge benefit to humankind, and you do not discover a chemical with those qualities very easily. It's extremely difficult to do because it has to have all of those properties. And it's easy. The bottom of my coffee cup will have some herbicidal properties, but don't try spraying it on large farms. So it's very hard to come up with these things. And I've lived through and been part of the golden age of herbicide discovery, where we'd wake up and there'd be a new herbicide almost every week. And that golden age, ladies and gentlemen, was over. It's because the low-hanging fruit's been picked. It's hard to discover new herbicides with all of those properties, with much higher regulatory standards than used to be the case. Rightly so. Much higher standards have to be met. Some of you remember all these names. These are all names of companies that had herbicide discovery programs back in '75 when I started to get interested in herbicides. You know plenty of them: American Cyanamid, Ciba-Geigy, Dow, DuPont, Eli Lilly, Hirsch, ICI, Monsanto. The names go on. They're all stopped. They've all been consolidated. No wonder we discovered lots of herbicides in the 70s and 80s, because there were lots of people looking for them and lots of companies with global programs. That's a number of companies. If you can add them up, there's 19 companies there that had global herbicide discovery programs in that period. How many are there now? Anyone want to guess? It's another good trick when you teach students. Focus the mind, because then you ask them a question. How many are there now, Nick? 5, good boy. I told you he was a good student. There's been massive consolidation. You know, many of us worry about the costs. There are high costs in running high-tech discovery programs, really high costs. So it's estimated it costs 750 million Australian dollars to produce a new herbicide. So you need deep pockets if you're going to discover herbicides. Very high, and rightly so, regulatory and environmental standards. And it's much harder to discover a herbicide now than it was before. So when you get one, ladies and gentlemen, treat them with the respect which they deserve, because an awful lot of work and goes into it. And as Nick said, there are only 5 companies now, 2 in Germany, BASF and Bayer, Corteva and FMC in the US in Syngenta. I reckon there's less than 200 chemists working at those companies. There was probably 2,000 at its peak. And yes, there's a lot of high tech. And yes, there's some small Japanese companies, but they've only got a rice focus. So the discovery effort at first appearances has gone down. It's certainly gone down for those big companies. But as always, it presents opportunity for others. So here's something which has occurred, Belinda, only in the last few years, and that's the appearance of startups that are focused on herbicide discovery, companies whose names you do not know at the moment. There are 13 startups with herbicide that are focused on, well, crop protection, but herbicide discovery around the world. Now, if you look at where those companies are, then it reflects my favourite word, Belinda, which is diversity. So what all these startups have reflecting is diversity. So you've got 3 or 4 of these companies like AgriMatch and AgPlanus in Israel. There's one in Australia. EncoChem in the US, Harp Bio in the US, King Agroot in China, Marone in the US, Micropep in France, MOA in UK, Earth in USA, Targonomics in Germany. Full disclosure, I'm on the scientific board of 3 of these startups. They're totally different to each other. They're taking totally different approaches to those big 5 chemical companies. And so I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that out of all of this, there will be new herbicide discoveries, new herbicides which will come to us, with 5 major companies, 13 startups, small Japanese companies and others. New herbicides with all the right properties will be discovered, but they'll be very rare. Bayer have already made public announcements that they've got a new mode of action which they expect to commercialise around 2030. If there's anyone from Bayer, ask them. And if they tell you anything, let me know, because they won't tell me any more about it. Do you know any more about it, Chris? Yeah. It's a new mode of action. It's selective in wheat. That's all I know. And I've tried to find out. But there's a new mode of action coming. If that's true, and they wouldn't make these commercial statements if they don't have high confidence, that's going to be a precious new resource, and we'll need to treat that with the respect and care that it deserves in every sense. All right, so answer to the first question, I believe that we will have new herbicides that we'll be able to use in broadacre Australian agriculture in the future with all of the right environmental properties. So in what remaining time I have, I want to address those other questions, is are there cost-effective alternative technologies to herbicides for weed control in big grain-growing paddocks? So the question, the words there are, not for a 5-acre flower farm in Holland, but for 1,000-acre Australian grain-growing paddocks, has a very big difference between coming up with weed control for a 5-acre flower farm in Holland, which will at the moment mostly be hand weeding, and a 1,000-acre or 10,000-acre or 20,000-acre grain farm. Are there going to be cost-effective technologies to herbicides for weed control in big grain-growing paddocks in Australia in the next 10, 15 years? Because going out past that is totally in the realm of speculation. Well, let's just consider some of them, and some of them that I won't consider. The first one, of course, is what many of you know, and what Chris and many others advocate, is all of the things that come into good farming. All of the agronomy that you all know. Of course, that has to be and will be part of and is non-herbicides. I always say the best, cheapest weed control technology is a good, healthy, competitive crop. But we're not going to discuss that today. It's obviously other venues. We could spend all day talking about good farming and weed control and diversity, when on a good thing don't stick to it, and all the other things that we've talked about over the years and that Chris and many others have talked about. So we're not talking about that. We're also not talking about HSD and the harvest seed destructor, which we've been heavily involved in Western Australia, which is now becoming highly adopted. Let's just briefly talk about some of these other things like electricity, flame, lasers and drones. Again, within that context of, thank you Belinda, again within that context of will we have it in the next 10, 20 years in broadacre Australian cropping. So let's just very briefly consider it. Won't do harvest weed seed control. That's an electric, I don't know if you can see it very well, an electric weed control unit in Australia, but it's from a European one. It's 12 metre in width and can travel at 7 kilometres an hour, which tells you something for a start. It has limited adoption in some European organic row crops, such as potatoes, but not so far in grain crops anywhere in the world. Now, the first thing about technologies is never say never. Let's not exclude the possibility that electricity be used for weed control in the future. But it's got quite a long ways to go before it's going to be used in broadacre Australian grain paddocks. There are all sorts of issues, fire being one of them in Australian context, but there are others. So let's have an open mind about whether electricity be used for weed control in the future. I certainly hope it comes, but right now don't expect it in the next few years for broadacre Australian agriculture. Well, I don't think you need to look at that very long to think that we're probably not going to use propane for weed control. Now these we shouldn't dismiss these because they're being used in organic agriculture. Most of you here are not involved in organic agriculture, but it's a viable market, and there are growers who supply those markets, and they need to come up with non-chemical ways of doing things, and that might work, it will work for certain situations, but not on a 20,000 acre farm in a low rainfall area of some part of Australia, like the Eyre Peninsula or Muckenbuden or some place like that. That's just not going to be feasible. So I think we can dismiss that for the immediate future. What about lasers? That's a commercial unit. That's a commercial unit from Carbon Robotics. It's autonomous, in fact. It's being used. They're being sold. They're used some of them are used in the Imperial Valley, the big flat valley in California. It produces huge amount of vegetables, some of it organic. It controls weeds. It travels at about 3 kilometres an hour and costs about $250,000. Is it feasible for big broadacre Australian farms? No, it's got a long way to go. Should we dismiss it? No. Who knows what will happen with technology? What do we know about technology? We know it gets, as it gets scale, it gets cheaper, and so maybe one day we'll be using lasers, but we're not going to be using them in the next decade in big broadacre farms in Australia, in my view. And the last one of these that I think are feasible, because I'm not talking about stuff that's still at the lab bench. There's lots of technologies still at the lab bench, and some of them will stay at the lab bench, and some of them will move out. But I'm talking about things that are here and now or likely to be. Drones. It'll surprise some of you to know that nearly 100% of the rice grown in Japan and Korea is sprayed with drones. Nearly 100%. Mostly contractors. I thought to myself when this was first being, oh well, yeah, I mean this is a big farm. This room is the average size of a Chinese farm. It's just that there's many millions of such farms, and they're highly productive. And every square centimetre is farmed. And if you've got a rice paddy this size of this room, you can spray it with a drone. And you can put fertiliser on with a drone. And so in Japan and Korea now, close to 100% of the herbicide applications are by drone. But are we going to spray 1,000 acre Australian low value wheat crops with a little drone like that? No. So drones have got a long way to go before they're going to be used in big broadacre agriculture. But they are widely adopted in Asia, now approaching 50% in China, and it'll go to very high usage because it makes sense. Most small Chinese farmers cannot afford to buy a drone, etc., but it's all contractors that are doing it. And I used to think, well, you know, batteries don't last very long. Well, you just come in with a whole array of batteries on the vehicle, so they got it worked out. But not for big paddocks. So my view for grain crops in Australia, herbicides will continue for at least the next 10 years, probably much longer, for weed control in big paddocks. That's not to say that the use of herbicides will not change. And John and Nick, as you mentioned, we need to be much better about our herbicide application than sometimes is the case. And I believe that precision spot spraying is a mini revolution in Australian and global agriculture. And now, in the last few minutes, Belinda, I just want to talk about what that actually means, although some of you, of course, will know it very well. We have been doing this for some time, haven't we? So-called green on brown. The use of fluorescence or camera sprayers on booms for weed control during the summertime. Probably find some today if we went out and looked. These are fluorescent sensors. They detect the fluorescence off green leaves, something Chris knows very well about. Interesting thing is the technology of those weed-type sensors was actually developed in Australia by a guy called Warwick Felton in Tamworth in New South Wales. But lamentably, like many technologies, it was actually commercialised in North America. But green on brown, I'm sure there are individuals here that either have their own rigs. Do you have one, Gary? Did you? No. Or it'd be contractors around your area that were doing it. Green on brown is precision spraying in its best use. There's a 90% saving. That is a 90% reduction in herbicide use. This is when there are green weeds, but they're spread throughout a paddock, and you don't have to spray nozzles on all the time. So when the boom goes over, the sensors, either these fluorescent sensors or the cameras, pick them up, turn the nozzle on, turn it off. In its best use, only 10%. Now, for all those that are worried, rightly, about spray drift and other issues, whether you're a grape grower or whether you're a broadacre farmer, surely this is a great development. In that the potential for drift and other things is much less if you're only spraying where the weeds are than when you spray the entire paddock. So this technology, which has been developed and is now in widespread use and is very familiar to many of you in this audience, is a very good development. And from an environmentalist viewpoint, must be something that any environmentalist who's aware of practical issues would think is a very good thing, as I certainly do. Doing so-called green on green, or in crop, is a much bigger technical challenge, as you would expect. It's one thing to have a fluorescent sensor to pick up anything that's green, but if it's a crop, the nozzles will be on all the time. So what's happened over the last 10 years or so has been the development of cameras, green on green, detection and spot spraying of green weeds in green crops on with boom mounted cameras, computers and artificial intelligence, which is just fast software which can be trained to recognise this is wild radish, this is something else. So they're high resolution cameras mounted on spray brooms with onboard AI powered computers that can identify weeds and spray, turn nozzles on, delivering spot spraying. Is anybody in this room doing this right now? Is there anybody in this room thinking that they might do it in the future? Thank you. My prediction is that this is a mini revolution, that there will become the widespread adoption in Australian agriculture of spot spraying of post-emergent herbicides with this technology. Right now, it's expensive, but it is commercially available. In the US, John Deere See and Spray. The interesting thing is See and Spray, you can see a few nozzles turned on there. See and Spray is in crop, green on green. The technology, the cameras which are mounted on that boom sprayer, was developed by a startup that John Deere then purchased. The startup was called Blue River, purchased by John Deere for $200 million, and that is the trend that we're seeing. You know, these big companies buying technology where it makes sense. So that's commercially available right now. In Australia, you can buy this right now. That's the Agrifac sprayer with the bilberry Trimble. Anyone heard of bilberry or Trimble? So that's an interesting one. Bilberry is a little French company that was started by 4, get this Chris, undergraduate students who were learning about this stuff in their, they were doing agricultural, they were doing electronic engineering. And when they graduated, they started Bilberry. The interesting thing is they moved the main guy, the founder, to Perth, and they did a lot of the work in Western Australia targeting wild radish, green on green, to train the AI to be able to identify the weeds. They proved that they could identify and spray wild radish in wheat crops in Australia, and they sold the company to Trimble, which is a multinational, well, it's a US GPS company. So again, this thing of small, nimble startups, smart people, and then selling the technology. So Bilberry Trimble technology is now available, and you can buy it in Australia. I think for a big boom spray, it's about $200,000 extra to go on the boom spray. Some of you will be thinking about that right now. I expect that this sort of technology will become widespread and adopted in broadacre Australian technology, agriculture. And it's, in my view, without any doubt, a good thing within the context, for example, of what much of today is concerned with, that if in the best circumstances we're spot spraying only where the weeds are, then we're using much less chemical. The drift potential is much lower when you're only spot spraying. The commercial outlay on herbicides is much lower than if you're spraying every square centimetre of every paddock. And some of you will be thinking, that's why I used the word mini revolution, because it changes everything. The first thing you'd be thinking from a farmer's perspective is, I can afford to spray something that's otherwise too expensive. But if you follow that through logically, and you're a company that's investing 175 million, you're not going to develop a herbicide that's only going to be sprayed in very small areas. So it's going to change all of that. It's going to change the way that regulation works, because regulation about what a barrier, where a waterway is, all those sorts of things will be different where you're spot spraying versus broadacre. So there's a whole lot of things got to change. But there you go, that's one. There's the gold acres. See the cameras mounted on here? So these are commercially available. You can buy them right now. And that's the Bilberry Trimble cameras mounted on there. I can tell you there have been the Bilberry one, the software, wild radish in Western Australian broadacre agriculture, very significant issue. And this can identify, especially late season, so well after post-emergent herbicides are used, you can go over the top and identify these wild radish and squirt them just where they are. And they tend to be random at that point. They're not all over the paddock. And you can buy these units right now. We're getting close, Belinda? 20 minutes. I'm going to be leaving lots of time for questions, which is a good thing. So the ideal system has, well, as I understand it, there are two ideal systems. One is the same nozzles are used, so you can use it and all the nozzles are on, and you can use it as a normal broadcast sprayer, or you can use it in the see and spray mode and the nozzles. In other cases, because as you might imagine, there's all questions about what's the optimum nozzles. In other cases, there are special nozzles and a separate tank on the sprayer, so it's got two systems. So all of that is still sort of under development, but you can buy them now. It's very good, as I said, for late post-emergent weed detection and spraying. Something that we know from our harvest weed seed control is a very good thing to do. So, and Chris, I'll put up there herbicide diversity, because you can use a lot of different chemicals that you couldn't use when you're spraying every square centimetre of every paddock. Now, this is one of, is anybody familiar or listened to a talk from Andrew Bates of Swarm Farm? I'm sort of in love with this Swarm Farm robotics up in Queensland. Andrew and Josie Bates, broadacre farmers, young farmers from Queensland, who, it's a classical startup situation. They have, over the last 10 years or more, been developing the Swarm Farm robots, which are small, lightweight, autonomous robots with sensors mounted on the spray boom behind the autonomous unit, delivering precision spot spraying. I reckon that Swarm Farm robots in Queensland is state-of-the-art globally. I reckon Swarm Farm, Nick, is state-of-the-art globally. If you wanted to look at the best performer, it's Swarm Farm, and certainly for Australia. That's their unit there. Can you see it? It's got, now Andrew believes that farm machinery has got too big and too heavy, and he believes the opposite is what we need. So you see the small autonomous robot at the front there, carrying a boom spray with a small tank because it's spot spraying. So there's not a huge 1,000 litres tank. You see the cameras mounted on the boom spray? That's state of the art. Now I know one farmer in Western Australia who's got this trundling across his 25,000 acres of wheat growing country right now. So it's in the early stage of adoption. I don't know whether anybody here has got one. But if you want to know, in my view, what the future looks like, that's one version of it right there. And well, I think we should really be very proud of Andrew and Josie Bates and what they've achieved. So your homework for tonight is, if you haven't looked at it, just write down Swarm Farm and get on your computer and look at their website. And what you'll see is a group of highly dynamic, highly motivated young people up in rural Queensland who are spending their time developing this system. And I like to think that I stay abreast of the technologies that are used in global broadacre agriculture, and I reckon they're as good as it comes. And next time, Nick and John, that you've got a big conference, invite Andrew Bates and allocate 2 hours or more, because he's also an excellent presenter and farmers love listening to him and asking questions. And as you can see, I'm a fan. I'm very impressed with Andrew and Josie Bates. All right, so in wrapping up, Belinda, for the next 10 years, going out and predicting the future past 10 years is fraught with errors. Just ask any economist. For big paddock grain crops in Australia and comparable parts of the world, herbicides will remain the dominant weed control technology. It is very hard to control weeds in big paddocks at low cost, and herbicides do the job. They may not be perfect, but they do the job. New herbicides will be discovered, but they'll be rare. If Bayer comes up with what they've said they've come up with, we should treat it as a precious resource and not spray it like it's going to be here forever. And the way to do that, of course, is with diversity, good agronomy, good farming, and all the things that we know but don't have time to talk about this morning. In my view, precision spot spraying will become widely adopted for knockdown and fallow and in-crop post-emergent herbicides in grain crops. And if that's true, Gary, then we'll have greater herbicide options, we'll have the diversity of greater herbicide options, we'll save dollars, and we'll have environmental benefits. And from the earlier comments, that looks like a considerable part of the motivation for why you are here today. Keep an eye on Swarm Farm, autonomous robots and sprayers. You know, I go to their website once a month or something just to make sure I know what they're doing. And finally, alternative technologies to herbicides. There's the efforts that we've seen with propane and electricity and things like that. We shouldn't discount them. They are first being used in high-value crops or organic crops, which can be very high value, for small niche markets. And we should encourage that, because out of that, some of that technology may stay in those, but some may become improved and perfected and developed and made for scale that could be used. So these alternative technologies, like the laser, may very well work for organic lettuce farms in the Imperial Valley of California, but out of that might flow technology that's cheaper for broadacre agriculture. So we should keep an eye on it, but not think that we're going to be using it tomorrow. So in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, herbicides and spot spraying, herbicides plus technology, the technology, all the technologies that we know, but the one of spot spraying, precision agriculture, is what, plus good agronomy, going to give us weed control into the future. Thank you, and Belinda, I'm happy to have any questions that anyone may have. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Steve, for giving us an update on the alternative technologies. And I loved your little title, The Future of Broadacre Weed Control is at Our Fingertips, and it looks exciting. What do we think, team? Do we have questions? Yes, down here. Thank you. If you could stand up, say your name, and I think a mic is coming your way.
How surprising that Peter Grokey would ask me a question. This is like a time warp. 30 years ago. Yes, Peter, what gentle and polite question are you going to hit me with?
I think what I'd first like to say is welcome back.
Thank you.
It has been such a privilege with your ability to go through research, extension, education and presentation. You're a bloody legend in agriculture.
Thank you.
So well done, and keep going. We need more like you to keep going. But really, I think what we're trying to get at is spray technology, but also agriculture in general has been so poorly treated through the whole system, including the political system. You know, we have got land use, we've got needed chemicals we need to keep in our toolkit. We've talked about resistant management and all of these other aspects of agriculture. And I think what is absolutely critical is in rural planning. You go through the university system, they don't even have rural education part of their criteria. This is absolutely disgraceful. But we go through and we talk about wanting new chemicals in our agricultural toolkit. And obviously there's restrictions now and there's lots of costs. And we have problems with the APVMA at times and the added burdens. So we're trying to encourage a huge investment trying to get new tools because we're going to have restrictions. I remember coming back from Europe in 1982 and I brought back a magazine and there was the extremist public with skull and crossbones on a black thing trying to say, you know, chemicals are dangerous for consumers in Europe, and it's accentuated over time. But I think what we need to do as an agricultural base is sell us as food security, good food. We don't want residues coming across into different agricultural commodities. We need to stop this spray drift, but we need to make sure that all of the system, the community at large, politicians, local government, understand that agriculture must have the tools. Take our tools away in best farm management, we have absolutely lost that ability to grow food. So I'd like to encourage you to help GPSA, PPSA, you know, Grains Council, whoever, grain growers, we need to sell ourselves better. I don't believe we're doing the job well enough so we can guarantee we're not going to have the threat of losing phenoxyacids or any other groups, paraquats threatened. How do we cope when large companies like Bayer get threatened with litigation? And where do we balance those outcomes in the extremist media? Thank you so much, Steve.
I don't know how to respond to that, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Peter. The rest of the day is about many of those issues, Peter. I have talked about the possible technologies. I have not said anything about the politics. those issues are real. I'm retired now. I can say whatever I damn well like. But I haven't sprayed or strayed into those areas because I think it's going to be covered, and what I just wanted to do was talk about some of the technologies. Any other questions that anybody has? Come on, don't leave a poor old man up here standing.
I had one handed to me, Steve, so while people are thinking about another one, I'm going to read this out. Farmers just get on with things and will willingly adopt these new technologies for the benefit of their farms. How important is it for us to communicate these technologies to wider community to build trust and our social licence?
Yeah, well, to the wider community, it's sort of two parts, isn't it? Yes, farmers obviously will adopt technology that they consider is in their interests and makes sense, and they need to have that communicated to them. I think Australian farmers are some of the earliest adopters in the world of technology, and I've got a project up in China. I'm going there next week, and there's a huge gap between the researchers and the universities, for example, and the farmers. I mean, the farmers never talk, whereas you've got Chris Preston here, who's every second day giving a talk to farmers. So technology moves quickly. Belinda, the second part of that, to the wider audience. I'm someone that has tried spectacularly unsuccessfully to do that over a long time, to communicate to city-based. I can answer it this way. I went to the dentist last week. Anyone who goes to the dentist knows that it tends to focus your mind, right, when you go to the dentist. And there was the nice young assistant and the dentist. And the assistant came from Brazil, so I was talking to her about Brazilian agriculture, and she was amazed because she came from a country area in Brazil. And then they both proceeded to tell me how bad glyphosate is for people and the environment. And I mean, I'm sitting in the chair, and the last thing you want to do is upset the dentist if you're sitting in the chair. So I was politely trying to disagree with them, but it was impossible because their minds were made up. So communication to change deeply entrenched values is not easy. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be done at every opportunity, but let's not underestimate it. And though you only got to look at Europe to see how strongly held some of those views are. Thankfully, some other parts of the world, including Australia, are more balanced than that, but that is an ongoing challenge, there's no doubt about it. People that live in inner cities in the world are now totally divorced from agriculture, and they don't have an appreciation for it. It's an extremely difficult challenge. It shouldn't be underestimated, which doesn't mean you don't take every attempt to do so. Belinda? Yeah.
Had one more question text through. Hang on, I just need to open it up. I quite like this one. In the words of Daryl Kerrigan, how much they asking? So cost. Let's talk about cost of some of those technologies.
So there's no doubt that at the moment the green on green cameras are expensive. And of course the proponents are saying, well, you've got to balance that against the savings that you get with herbicides. And that can be very real. And there are many farmers who are making those calculations as to what, when and what they're going to adopt. Over the next 10 years, though, the economics of that will look attractive in direct answer to the question, Belinda, just as when the green on brown nozzles were first introduced, right, Nick? They would have been too expensive for your farmer clients. So who adopted them first? Contractors. And now your bigger farmers, I'll bet, are doing it. And most big broadacre Western Australian grain growers with 15 to 20,000 acres that I know have got green on brown nozzles, and they would all say they're extremely cost effective because of the herbicide savings they're making, and they'll make the same decisions about the green on green. But of course, the technology initially is expensive, Belinda, and I think to put the Trimble nozzles on a full on the boom is of the order of 200,000. Sorry, not the nozzles, the camera, AI, the software, about $200,000 on top of a $700,000 or $800,000 self-propelled sprayer. So, but you watch it; it's happening. Finally, until recently, Swarm Farm were not selling that machine; they're leasing it to farmers. I think they're now starting to sell them, but that's the other way, is that Swarm Farm, you lease the machine for a few years, and you watch. Yep, the economics will fit, or those companies won't exist.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Steve Powles. Big round of applause. Thank you again. We're now going to move into a session titled Why Spraying Right Matters, Future Risks If We Get It Wrong. I'm really pleased to welcome to the floor Professor Chris Preston, who's a Professor of Weed Management at the University of Adelaide. So I've had the privilege of knowing Chris since I did work experience with him when I was 16 years old, and he was an inspiration then and he's an inspiration now. He works tirelessly on behalf of the agricultural sector to talk about best practice weed management, managing herbicide resistance weeds. He's done countless publications. He's on his feet, out in the communities, working tirelessly. Chris, thrilled to have you here. Let's make him welcome Professor Chris Preston.
All right. We good now? Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start off and take my glasses off now that I've got the equipment running. I'm going to start off and I'm going to tell you that I didn't grow up on a farm. I'm more than 2 generations from the farm. I'm a city kid. My whole family are city people. I live in the city. And you go out and you meet people and you have dinner with people and they say, "Oh, what do you work on, Chris?" "Oh, I work on weed control, weed management." And makes for some really, really interesting conversations with a lot of people. And I actually have, as part of the things that I do, is actually spent quite a bit of time not only communicating to the agriculture community, but spending some time communicating to other communities. And one of the things that comes out of that is that you do learn what communities are concerned about, rightly or wrongly, and you certainly can try and change their impressions of what they're doing, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go along. So one of the things, I've been told I should need to stand behind the speakers so that I don't get feedback, so I'm just going to move back a bit. Why spraying really matters? This is why it's going to matter in the long run. I'm out talking to the urban community, and I can tell you that they've become increasingly sceptical about pesticide use in agriculture. And that, for us, in agriculture, is actually a problem. It's part of the problem we've got. And you might think, "Oh, well, they'll get over it, it won't be a problem." I also happen to live in a council area in Adelaide that has passed a bylaw around cat management. And despite the fact that most people in the council weren't terribly concerned about cats, some people were very, very vocally concerned about them. And in the end, what it boiled down to, it wasn't the cats were eating all the native birds. It was actually the cats would go and dig holes in people's gardens and leave them little surprises in their garden that they were really concerned about. So now we have a law that cats have to be on your property 24 hours a day. And sadly, I happen to be married to a mad cat lady. And so I've had to cat-proof our property. And if you really want to see something really interesting that's got nothing to do with agriculture, there's a little company called Ocelot. and they make equipment. Originally they started off with possums, but it's now sold for cats, to keep cats on your property. Go and look at their videos. They are some of the funniest things you've ever seen. All right, so just because you think it's not going to happen doesn't mean that it won't happen. But there are some things we can do about it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some headlines from newspapers, all really taken from the last year or so, just to show you some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And one of them is this, and I think you'd all be aware of this. Glyphosate causes cancer. This is yet another headline about a looming but mostly stalled class action lawsuit in Australia. Now, I've actually been out on your behalf around glyphosate, talking to people about why these headlines are actually not what we should be worrying about. So a few years ago, the Senate had an investigation of glyphosate, and I fronted the Senate committee over it. If you have trouble sleeping, they actually recorded this, so you can go and watch the 45 minutes of me answering questions of the Senate committee, and I'm sure it'll get you to sleep. And I think I almost convinced the Green senator on the committee that farmers in Australia can use glyphosate safely. Okay, so I can go out and do that. I can go out and help you guys deal with issues like this. That's not the only issue we've got. Pesticide residues in food, that's been mentioned a couple of times. This is actually from a consumer magazine. And it's about how to avoid contaminated products. We're talking about minuscule amounts of material in there. And people are saying, oh, we've got to avoid that. We've got to avoid these contaminated products. This one's from The Conversation. We would normally consider The Conversation to be an intellectual magazine. It's an online magazine. I've actually written articles for it. And it says, glyphosate, the active ingredient in the weed killer Roundup, is showing up in pregnant women living near farm fields. And that raises health concerns. Now, this is an example of a situation where technology's got so good we can measure minute amounts of chemicals in places. And I look at this and I go, knowing what I know about glyphosate, knowing what I know about agricultural chemicals, this is one of the least of the problems that pregnant women actually do face in terms of risks. So I run into people who tell me that we should avoid all agricultural chemicals and we should also be drinking raw milk. And that sends shivers down my spine, because raw milk is much higher frequency of contamination with pathogenic bacteria, and this used to be a major problem until a gentleman in France called Pasteur invented pasteurisation. That's why we do it. But people have those views, and so we're always running up against some of these views, and you might just dismiss them, but then you're left trying to keep your cats in your yard. Pesticides can be measured in urine. I think this is one thing that we're going to see more and more and more of, because technology's got so good that we can measure pesticides wherever we want to go and measure pesticides and find them. This one, disturbing, weed killer ingredient tied to cancer found in 80% of urine samples. Disturbing. Knowing what I know about glyphosate, it's a water-soluble molecule. If it's found in urine, it tells you that your kidneys are working. Okay, that's where it should be. Any glyphosate you pick up in food should go out in your urine. That's what we want to have happen. But it can be spun as a story of this is a major drama for us. And so I'm happy to go into bat for that one and go, look, I can talk to you about chemistry, and I can talk to you about how it works, and I can talk to you about where we're going to expect to see that if we have a small amount of exposure, where it's going to turn up. And I would say, knowing what I know about all the agricultural chemicals that we deal with, is that glyphosate is one of the least of our problems, yet it's getting a lot of focus. But that's not the only thing that we're starting to see. Spray drift is now starting to be recognised as a concern by the community. 10 years ago, when I was doing a lot of stuff around agricultural chemicals, and before that, when Belinda came and worked for us, we were doing all this stuff about genetically modified crops and how dangerous they were to people. I'd be going, actually, one of the worst things that happens in agriculture is spray drift, and yet nobody's concerned about it. Well, that's something that, farmers have actually got in their back pocket, because the worst thing you're doing, nobody's got any concerns about. It's all under the carpet. This was a headline in the ABC at the beginning of last year. I actually used this at the end of last year as an exam question for my undergraduate students. And the question was, why did it happen and what can farmers do about it? Farm chemical spray drift causing widespread tree deaths. This is in Western New South Wales. Once the community is starting to be concerned about this, then we're going to have some real problems. Because this is something that if they have a Senate inquiry on, and somebody says, Chris, can you go and front the Senate inquiry and deal with this problem? I can't defend you. I can't defend you over spray drift. I can defend around the way you're using chemicals, and I frequently go and talk to people, and they talk to me about agricultural use of chemicals in Australia, and I tell them Australian farmers are some of the best farmers in the world. They do things right. They pay attention to those little details, and we really should be confident that our farmers are farming well, that we don't have the same issues that when I go to North America I see, for example, or go to South. If you really want to get horrified, go to South America and see what's happening. And I think Steve would back me up in terms of some of the practices farmers down there use around chemical. We're really good at this, but every so often we get it spectacularly wrong. And I think that one of the things we've really got to worry about going forward is how do we keep the community with us? And I think we can only keep the community with us by doing the right thing, by demonstrating that as farmers we can do it right. So what are the risks? Well, the low-hanging fruit risk is the loss of individual products, and I'd put 2,4-D up there as being perhaps the product that's seriously in the frame. We've had the regulator, the APVMA, move from registrations to permits. It's sometimes when people ask me about it, I say, well, I think it's almost inevitable that we're going to lose 2,4-D. We don't have to, but I think it might be a product that we lose. But one of the things that I discovered from my days around genetically modified crops is a lot of the time people take the fixing of a small problem by banning or removing something as a win and an effort to then deal with everything else they don't like. So ultimately, we may end up in a situation where we no longer have the social licence to apply any pesticides at all. That's probably the big risk component down the track. And if we end up in that situation, it will be because the community it's not residues in food that are driving that. It'll be those large events that cause serious community concern. So I just want to talk now about a bit of a case study, if you like. So in July 2021, I was sent this photograph by a member of the community. They happen to live in a town on the York Peninsula, and that's a house plant, but it's not supposed to be variegated. And they sent it to me and said, Chris, do you know what this is? And I said, absolutely. That is drift. of a herbicide that has just been released this year called Overwatch. And I know that a bunch of agricultural consultants in the room, and I think in 2021 pretty much every one of them got on my phone to talk about some of the issues we're seeing with this herbicide. They were mostly wanting to talk to me about what was happening to crops, but a number of them did want to talk to me about what was happening outside of crops, so what was happening on roadsides, what was happening elsewhere. So that's Overwatch, and you know, I sat there and went, really, I don't think this should be happening, because I know it's been updated, and that's a little bit small, and I'm going to read it for you, but this is off the Overwatch product label, and it says, do not allow bystanders to come in product with a spray cloud. Well, that's obvious. Do not apply in a manner that may cause unacceptable impact to native vegetation, significant crops, and a lot of other different things. Buffer zones and so on. Do not apply unless the wind speed's between 3 and 20 kilometres per hour. Do not apply if there are hazardous surface temperature inversion conditions. Do not apply by a broom sprayer unless you're following requirements are met. Spray droplets are not smaller than a core spray quality. Minimum distances between application and downwind areas. If farmers had actually followed exactly what was on the label, then we should have minimum incidents of off-target damage from Overwatch. It's all there. All the information a farmer needs to get it right is on the label. So this was from the ABC December last year. Herbicide Overwatch suspected of bleaching spray drift damage in regional South Australia, and I'm going, we're 2 years down the track from that initial event where we all discovered that pre-emergent herbicides can actually drift, to we've still got problems. There are still problems out there. This is extremely visual. You know, somebody's plants in their garden go white. It's very, very easy to see. And I know FMC's been running a series of spray workshops, and you know, I really commend them for getting on the front foot and doing that. But this is a product which really, it's a pre-emergent herbicide. We should never allow it to drift, because if we're going to use this herbicide properly, this is what we want to be doing. It's a pre-emergent herbicide. The target is the soil, okay? It's not the stubble. If you're not aiming to hit the soil, you're doing it wrong. We want large droplets because we want them to go through the stubble. I've got a photo of wheat stubble there. That's actually pretty thin, pretty easy to get through, but you know that often you've got to get that product down through the stubble and onto the soil. And we talk about these herbicides and go, yeah, it's okay, they'll wash off stubble. That takes time. And while that time is taken to wash that into the ground, you've got weeds germinating. So your herbicide is not working as well if it's on the stubble compared to if it's on the soil. So large droplets, and the label says coarse, but I think that you probably should go larger than that for pre-emergent herbicides. And if you can do it with air induction nozzles, that's probably the best. The value of air induction nozzles with pre-emergent herbicides, remember the target's the soil, is they'll go down, they'll hit the soil, and they'll spread across the soil surface and give you the sort of coverage you need. You don't need the same level of coverage with a pre-emergent herbicide as you might think you do for spraying seedling weeds, because your target is the soil. The soil's really easy to hit. Slow down. I think there's one real message about spraying pre-emergent herbicides and getting them where you need to go. Slowing down would be one of those, because when you drive at speed, what happens is you tend to drag the droplets behind you a little bit. And if they're going down sideways, they're more likely to hit the stubble than if they're going straight down. So the slower you drive, the more you're going to get on the ground and the less you're going to get on the stubble. So putting it out at 25 kilometres an hour, you're losing a bunch of product. And delta T. For pre-emergent herbicides, Delta T is nowhere near as important. Delta T was built for glyphosate. Okay? It's about the humidity required so that glyphosate can get taken up into the leaf. Now, we don't want to go ridiculous. There's no point going out and spraying on a 40-degree day when it's 10% humidity. But you can certainly spray pre-emergent herbicides under delta T conditions that you would think might be just a bit marginal for glyphosate. There's no problem at all, because you're going to use big droplets and you're hitting the ground and they don't need to be taken up by leaves. Okay, they're going to get taken up after it rains. So, you know, we actually have more opportunity to put pre-emergent herbicides out properly. We don't have to be trying to get these herbicides out under the perfect ideal conditions that Delta T would tell us we should be using. So, you know, they don't have to go out at night. We can put them out quite comfortably in the daytime, particularly at that time of the year. But I think that, you know, getting the right practice with pre-emergent herbicides is going to make your herbicides work far better than getting it wrong. And this is why I'm saying about the overwatch damage that it really shouldn't occur. There's no reason for it to occur, and if it's occurring, it's because you're not getting product working the way it should be working. We're wasting that product. So I think in terms of, you know, how I look at the future around chemicals, you know, I spend a lot of time, as I said, because I'm a city kid, talking to people in the city, and sometimes it really, really depresses you as to what their thoughts and attitudes are. But I think you've got to recognise that's actually real, and these people have power. And, you know, from sitting there thinking, oh, no, we're not going to get cat laws like that, we're not going to get cat laws that extreme. Yeah, we've got them. So, you know, these things could happen to us, and they're going to happen if people do the wrong thing. As I go back and say, I don't think, you know, minor residues in food, we're going to see that, that's going to be in the press and all that sort of stuff. It's not actually going to drive people in the city to say we have to have change. What will drive them to do that will be a large event. That's the primary thing that suddenly tips people over. It's always a large event that tips people over from going, maybe I'm a little worried about this, to it absolutely has to stop. So we need to make sure we don't have those, and I feel that one of those is spray drift, and as I say, the community's suddenly woken up to spray drift. They're suddenly noticing that it's out there. And whilst we might lose 2,4-D, getting the community offside mightn't actually be about a molecule like 2,4-D. It might be about a molecule which has different properties, but is really easy to see, like Overwatch. Or it might be because we can test stuff so much more cheaply now and so much easily that people suddenly discover that they've got fungicides in their urine, and they start worrying about what's happening to them. So it may not actually be herbicides at all. It might be fungicides or something else that'll tip that over. But we can put off that day, maybe forever, if we don't allow products to move off farm. So if we can keep them on farm, we're going to be in a much better space. And as I say, I'm going to find it a whole lot harder to defend you guys and your practices if we're not having these sort of things going on. I'm going to actually finish there, Belinda. I suspect I've said a few challenging things, and I'm really fine if people want to disagree with me. So thanks very much.
Let's open it up for questions. And firstly, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. It's got us thinking. We're opening it up. What do you think? Over here, thank you. If you'd like to, we'll send Rowan over with the mic. And if you could say your name and your question, that'd be great. Thank you.
Now you're talking about different droplet sizes. So you go and use Overwatch, so you want large droplet size or very coarse. And we're mixing that with glypho, we're trying to chase small ryegrass. There's a problem.
Yeah, so one of the issues that we do have is that we've got a range of compromises we make when we're spraying as soon as we try and put more than one product in the tank. And yeah, I understand fully that there's no way that you can go across your farm and just have one product in the tank all the time. So I think one of the things we've got to worry about is which compromises do we want to make. So one of the things that's increasingly starting to happen amongst farmers is they're discovering that all the things they add to glyphosate in the tank mean they have to spray differently to the way glyphosate should go out. So the best way to put glyphosate out, we can get small ryegrass with big droplets with glyphosate because you only have to hit them once, provided you get everything else right. Okay? And the way to do it is we go out with a lower water volume, so we're looking about 60 litres as probably being about where we are, so we get a nice concentrated droplet of glyphosate on there, and that helps drive us in. Now, that's for glyphosate because it is a herbicide that translocates really widely. Almost every other herbicide we're using doesn't do that. So as soon as we mix something with glyphosate, we're going to compromise. We're going to go, all right, we're going to have glyphosate less concentrated than it really likes to be, or we're going to go with different droplet size. So how do we manage that? And so one thing I'm seeing farmers starting to do is particularly around, double knock practices, is they're putting glyphosate out alone. So they get that right as their first application. Everything else goes in the second tank, where you're not compromising things as much. But it's one of those challenges that you as a farmer are going to have, is that I want to mix 4 things in my tank. How do I get them all to work and work well? Sometimes, some of them we can go, well, actually we can fix that problem by doing something else. So one of the things we can do with glyphosate, because we know it likes to be concentrated, if you're going to go from 60 litres to 90 litres, is that you can add some more glyphosate to the tank, and that'll help. So there are some ways that we can handle some of these compromises, but ultimately at the end of the day, I think the days of us thinking we can put 7 products in the tank and actually get them all to work, no, that's just, we're kidding ourselves. At least one of those products is not doing the job it's supposed to be doing because we've got everything else in the tank there. I can see Mary nodding her head down the front here. It's just from a chemical point of view, I know that's not going to work. So it's about making sure that how do we actually put the things together that work well together, and how do we then end up being able to do the job we want to do? And I would say that amongst the guys like yourself, the broadacre growers I know, I think most of them are actually have too little capacity in their boom sprays compared to what they want to do. And if you want to come up and argue with me, I'm going to point to spring of 2022, when you guys couldn't get enough fungicide on because you had 1 spraying day a week. So, we have a capacity problem. And I think one of the things we want to be thinking about is how do we actually, I'm sure Mary might talk about this, how do we actually manage capacity into the future? So what are our options in doing that? And I don't think our option is to dump everything in the same tank and try and do it all at once. I think our option, we need to think more creatively than that. And the stuff Steve's talking about, the spot sprayers, both the in-crop ones and the fallow ones, are probably an avenue for us to actually change that dynamic where we can actually afford to, particularly if you get a robot that does the work for you, you can afford to change how you're doing things and actually go out perhaps more often and make each product work the way it's supposed to work.
Thanks for the question. Do we have another question from the team? Mick. Hang on, Mick. We might just get the mic over to you. It's a fairly big space.
It's sort of backing up what Chris is saying, that there have been 2 projects locally, one of them conducted by Bill Gordon. I see Peter Cousins is here. Droplet size was not a limitation to summer weed control. And in fact, the larger the droplet, the better the summer weed control. And backed up by the fact that delta T was almost insignificant. The second one was there was a great stubble initiative by the GRDC conducted at Pinery, which also showed that there was no requirement for medium or small droplets for weed control for ryegrass. So just question the use that people need small droplets for young ryegrass, because the evidence just isn't there that very coarse droplets don't work.
Yeah, so I think, the evidence that's shown over the years, and I know that Syngenta did a lot of work around paraquat, which we think are a real contact herbicide, and they were going to coarse droplets, and they would get good control if they put their water rate up, because it's not the droplet size that matters, it's the number of droplets you get on the target. And increasing your water rate increases the number of droplets you get on the target.
Thanks, Mick. Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. Basically, the complexity comes under rules and laws regarding spray drift, and some of them are very sensible and some of them are questionable. I guess what I'm trying to get at is minuscule ability to find extremely small traces of chemical, and under common law it's illegal to have spray drift. So the examples that I'll share, and I'd like your opinion on how we can get better at this, is we've got massive enlargements of peri-urban housing. It doesn't matter whether it's Malala, Virginia, New Concordia, Roseworthy, with 40-metre setbacks from the rear of houses to the broadacre cropping land. And according to common law, there's no drift allowable. So basically farmers can be issued under two laws. What the issue becomes is obviously many of the chemicals we use require a buffer. And if that buffer really is quite commonly 100 metres, why would all of the developers only be forced to give 40 metres at the rear of their buildings? And when we have predominant wind directions on many of these regions during the planting period, it basically means that there's an inability to spray your crops on time. And I think timing has been the absolute golden aim to achieve maximum yield if we can't get our crops on time. But what I'm trying to get you to comment on is, obviously I'm so pleased that you're able to speak to some of these peri-urban people who don't understand agricultural needs, but some of the laws should actually be changed. So therefore, if someone does this chemical traceability monitor in their backyard and they find that they've got a billionth of a gram of pesticide on that monitor, we can technically be sued. I think it's crazy.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we discover about laws is that we set up laws based on the technology that we have today. And in 20 years' time, we've got brand new technology that allows us to measure things that we could never ever measure. And laws get outdated and we don't change them. My father actually worked for the Australian government writing legislation, and he wrote what's called the Defence Force Discipline Act, which he did in the late 70s, early 80s. Before they actually passed that act, it was still legal in Australia as a punishment for sailors to keel haul them. We were the only country in the world where that was still legal. This is one of the things that we struggle with. Now, if we need change, I know who you should be talking to. It's the guys over here at GPSA. Get in their ear, because that's their job. Their job is to lobby government to get rules changed if they need to be changed, and it needs to be evidence-based. They need to be able to provide evidence that this rule is no longer useful, helpful or acceptable. Get in their ear. My role in this is much more in a sort of public-facing role. I'll happily go and talk about various things around agriculture, and I did a lot of work over GM crops, for example, with politicians, trying to get them over the line that this isn't something we should be worrying about. We've got much bigger things to worry about. So, those things, I think, they're GPSAs, they're your lobby group for it. They know who's who, and they're the people to think about it, but I think it's thinking about which bits do we need to change, and that's the crucial component of it, and being able to provide that evidence that this is no longer a useful look.
Chris, thank you for your question, Peter. Peter Cousins.
Peter Cousins. Chris, I was just you put up there that 2,4-D is likely to be the first chemical that maybe we'll lose. Being involved in that stuff for a long time, once we lose one, there's going to be a bit of a snowball effect, I think. So what do you think in the next groups that'll go as well?
Look, Peter, one of the things that worries me, as I said, is that, my involvement in these things with the community is that for some people, once they have what they call a win, and they get something banned, it then's an opportunity to try and ban a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm just wondering what my local council's going to do now that they've done cats. Dogs, of course, are all done. Maybe it's going to be rabbits or something else. Where are they going to go? So which other groups? I think the biggest risk ones are ones where people can find and create concern about. So I'm sitting here, in 2022, talking to FMC about if we don't get this fixed, they might actually lose Overwatch as a product if it continues to drift. And we had a long conversation about what strategies might we be put in place to help that. And some of that's turned up on the label that I showed you. Some of it's turned up in their campaigns and in the sort of messaging that they and I are giving to people who are using that product. So we're trying to protect that product. But it could well be insecticides or fungicides, because if they're turning up in water, they're turning up in measurements of urine. Everybody can go and get their urine measured now if you want to know what's in it. All that's going to happen is something turns up that people can finger and say, this is dangerous. They're trying to do it with glyphosate, but the trouble is the glyphosate has got so little toxicity in the big scheme of things that it's really hard to get traction. But if you've got something like some of those insecticides, which are truly toxic, and they're turning up, we're going to find it much, much harder to keep them. So it depends, I think. If I was on the other side and wanting to do this, I know where I'd go. I'd know what I'd be focusing on. So that's why I'm saying these are the things where I think we might have a bit of trouble. It's in these sorts of spaces.
Thanks for the question. One over here, thank you.
Chris, I think it's extremely important that we don't single out products. We're talking about 2,4-D and we're talking about Overwatch. It's not the product that's actually drifting, it's the droplet that's drifting. And so every single component within that tank is actually drifting in that droplet. And most of these products are multiple tank mixers. So we need to be very careful that that droplet is drifting, not blame the product as such.
Yeah, look, Andre, I think that was sort of part of what I was, coming to, that, nobody actually ever talked about pre-emergent herbicides drifting until we saw Overwatch. And my immediate reaction to that was that everything else you're spraying is doing exactly the same. It's just you're not seeing it. And this is where I'm going, is that those ones are visible. So those are the ones that the public is potentially going to focus on. And so they will be the ones where it will come under as much pressure. But at some point it's going to tweak that if these products are drifting, everything else is as well. And where do we go from there? So I think it's a really, really important point, Andre, to consider that, I've fingered a couple of products because they're visible, but it is everything else, and everything else is potentially under threat. And my answer to Peter's comment was not really so much about herbicides. Herbicides are the ones we worry about drifting because we see the effects, but fungicides and insecticides are also drifting. And people measuring things, they're more likely to come up as a danger than herbicides. So I think we have to think about the whole lot, how we're spraying.
Another question down the back, thank you.
So, Chris, we lost chlorpyrifos this year, and I just wondered whether you'd comment whether you thought it was lost because of farmers' use patterns or toxicity
Primarily, it was lost because of toxicity, but compounded by the fact that the regulator couldn't see a way to manage the residues below the limits they wanted. So one of the things that, well, sometimes, so one of the things that happens with our regulator, fortunately for us, is they run a risk assessment, and if they look at a product and say, we've got a bit of a problem with this product in terms of the residues in grain, it might be too much, they might go, well, we can reduce the rate. So, or if it's getting, I did a bit of stuff around Diaron when, we lost all the big rates of Diaron because it was killing coral in the barrier reef, and they can do that. But if they can't find a way of managing that risk to what in this case, residues are about what the market wants, they can't find a way to manage that risk, then we won't be able to use it. We've seen haloxyfop in canola go this last year, and that was all about Europe changing the MRL. So that limited detection, that means you basically can't use haloxyfop in canola because some will be in the grain, and that just meant we can't use that product. We'll see more of these. We're going to see more of these because this is the way to manage that market risk. So that one, it'd be a combination. It would be the toxicity, so markets are concerned, and then the regulator looking at practice and going, well, we can't see how farmers can change their practice sufficiently to make it so that we don't get those residues. So it's quite a complex interplay. So we can lose things simply because markets change and they decide they don't want them, or we can lose them because producers can't use them in a way that means that they don't get into places where they shouldn't be. And sometimes we will just lose individual practices, or sometimes we might lose the whole chemical if there's no way to manage that.
Another question for Chris. Yeah, thank you, down the back.
Thanks, Chris. We've got a chemical that we can use in pulses, a fungicide, which has a side effect of killing white snails as well. How do we manage that going forward, because it's not registered to be used in cereal crops? How do we encourage manufacturers to look at that?
Okay, this is one of those really, really challenging areas, and I will say that I know a lot about agricultural chemicals, and I think I can know when we can use stuff that's a little bit off-label and it'll be okay. But even I get it wrong. And so I think the risk we run as soon as we move off-label, particularly if we're moving off-label for crops, rates, so higher rates or late timings, any of those shift will going to increase our chance of putting extra residue in the grain, and that's our problem. So using it on a crop we're not allowed to use it on, there's just nowhere to go if you can't get a company to do the development work for you. And for that chemical, the answer is going to be nobody's going to do it because Europe are going to change their laws. And we probably won't be able to use it in any pulses we want to export to Europe. So, I go and talk to the GRDC about some of these things that come up and go, is there any chance of getting this labelled? And it comes a long discussion about markets. Which markets are going to get upset about it? Occasionally we do things. So one I was involved in was glyphosate for crop topping in canola. We had to change the MRL. Fortunately, we had a really low MRL in Australia and the international one was much higher. So we could change to the international one and make that practice work. But as soon as you're putting a product on late in your crop, there's always a high risk of breaching those MRLs. So it's a space where I think as practitioners, you shouldn't be going.
I can spot Gordon down the back from GRDC. Sorry to put you on the spot, Gordon, but GRDC just have put a media release out about this. Do you want to perhaps say a few words?
I really was trying to hide. I got as far back as I could. So on the carbendism scenario, yeah, I mean, we did come out publicly and basically said that GRDC would not be investing in the space of trying to expand the carbendism label. Yeah, there is all the talk and pressure from growers about snail control, and I won't say I'll go one way or the other as to the efficacy of that. But the bottom line for carbendism is, as a molecule, that compound is under global threat. It will come up for renew again domestically in time. The residues will be there. The MRLs aren't there in international trade, so it puts all the trade at risk, as Chris has just been pointing out. And the bottom line, I mean, I looked at that one 5 or 6 years ago. It just will not get through modern regulatory science. The registration just would not be achieved because of the type of compound, the type of chemistries, the OH&S, the environment, and everything else that has to go through it. So, yeah, it's just chasing a black hole that we would never be able to achieve. So we're not going there. And therefore the emphasis is on industry and the life science companies to find other solutions. Because, yeah, it just, modern contemporary science, it just is not achievable.
Just want to comment as well on what the EU is looking to do in regards to reducing the MRL down to the limit of detection, which I think is 0.001. What's happening in that space?
So sorry, I missed the very first bit of that.
Well, we were chatting with some of the SARDI team, and they were discussing that there may be a change in Europe to reduce the MRL for carbendism down to the limit of detection. So even we know that Australia usage, even on label, greatly exceeds this in grain. Carbendism is not being supported by current registrations, so I guess there's going to be a change in Europe. What is it? Tell us about what's happening.
So my understanding is it's a bit like the haloxifop in Europe, in that, yep, their regulatory system has made certain changes and decisions, which is bringing that detectable residue, the MRL, down to basically zero, 0.001, limited detection, as you've mentioned. That's their right. What does that mean for our use of those compounds? Well, and Chris mentioned the haloxifop. I mean, as an industry, you've decided that we basically can't use that in canola and meet the market expectations, and the recommendation and the suggestion by industry to growers is to look for alternatives, not to use haloxifop. The same changes were made for haloxifop MRLs in pulses, and it was 0.05, not 0.01. And the changes have been made now for carbendism. I guess the good news is at the moment that from an Australian export industry, pulses are relatively small. The EU is not a significant market. So the exporters and trade believe they can manage that risk, coming back to risk management, through the use of grower vendor declarations and that sort of thing. So the trade can manage the risk because mainly our pulses are going elsewhere and they have different market requirements. So again, it comes back to risk management. Traders can do so, they're saying so at the moment. So domestic use of, say, haloxifop and pulses or carbendism as per the label at the moment in our lentils, we can manage those export risks at the time being, as long as we're doing the right damn thing. We start, when I started with ICI, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, she'll be right, we'll go and do it. I made lots of recommendations like that 20 plus years ago. We just can't do that anymore. We've got to state a label because that is how that risk is then mitigated, with the understanding that the application in the field is as per label and it flows through the entire supply chain.
Thanks, Gordon. Any questions, comments? Chris, any further thoughts from you on that one?
No, I think everybody's pretty keen to get a coffee. And
I had one last one, which came from one of the GPSA team. Following the chemical label when spraying is law, do you think more enforcement or training in this area needs to be undertaken? Why or why not?
Okay. I think one of the things that does concern me about spraying of agricultural chemicals is how little farmers actually know about the minor details on the label. They're relying a lot on their agronomists to do that work for them. And I think that, the farmers here, if you're relying on your agronomist to do that work for you, it means that if your agronomist says you should do it this way, this way, this way, that's how you should do it. Okay, because you haven't actually gone and necessarily read the fine detail on the label yourself. Of course, you're always welcome to go and read all the fine detail. I spend a lot of time reading product labels. I can tell you it's a really boring exercise, but really important in terms of understanding how. I'm mostly worried about understanding why things go wrong. So I go and read labels when things go wrong to try and work out what people did to make it wrong. But it really does, there's always stuff on the labels that you look at and you go, how did that end up there? Sometimes it's there because it's always on a label. Sometimes it's there because it's really important. And, I'm not picking on Overwatch Andre, but the guys at FMC have done a lot of work over their Overwatch label based on all that understanding of what went wrong in 2021. Okay, so they really did the hard work for you. So go and read the label. Understand the conditions that caused all the issues we had in 2021 and don't do it again. Just following the label will mean that we won't actually end up in that space. So, enforcement, look, the label, it's a legal document. If it says do not on the label, it means you're not allowed to do it. Does that get you into trouble? Sometimes. So one of the things that I used to do a bit of was, we got a few minutes so I can tell a long story. I used to do a bit of was some work around herbicide damage cases. And sometimes it was contractor spraying the wrong thing and so on and so forth. And I ended up getting involved in a spray drift case in northern New South Wales. And it was quite clear to me from all of the evidence that I saw that the person who did this was the person who farmed the field next door. And it was spray drift through the fence onto a cotton crop. But that's not who they'd fingered. They'd actually fingered an aerial operator who was trying to spray out some trees kilometres away. And when it rolled up in court, despite the fact that that aerial operator was probably not responsible for that spray drift, they were the one who they lost their court case over it. They went to appeal, they lost their appeal. Why did they lose their court case? I put it down, I was an expert witness in this, I put it down to one thing. What they was doing was off-label. And when I was sitting up there in the stand and I was asked the question directly, was this mix this operator had sprayed off-label? I said, absolutely yes. There is no label that supports what they were doing. And I think that that was the key thing that tipped that court case over. So, just being off-label can get you into trouble in the wrong circumstances. And I think, I'll tell you, I've been an expert witness in a court case. You don't want to be in a court case about herbicide damage and spray drift. It's just something you don't want to do. Okay, and I've got no skin in that game at all, but it's a tough experience, even for somebody like me. These lawyers aren't, well, mostly, they're really bright. I did run into one once where I thought the lawyer was a bit dim because they asked all the wrong questions. But they ask you really important probing questions. And so I was going, all the evidence shows, it wasn't that group of herbicides that caused the damage. It was obviously this herbicide and this herbicide. And then they came out with that key question. Was what the aerial operator sprayed on label? And I went, no. And that's what they were after. They were after an expert to stand up there and say the aerial operator had done something wrong, so then they could argue to the judge that that aerial operator had done the wrong thing, therefore it was her fault. Cautionary tale. It actually cost the contractor, their company. So, I think it's really, really important that we stay on label, particularly around, as I said, around things where we are aware that there might be some issues. So rates, timings, crops, they're the really, I think, the really important things around being on label. You know, occasionally we talk about, in particular circumstances with some of these products that tend to be a little bit damaging, about reducing the rate a bit. That's fine. That's not going to get you in any trouble to anybody but you. But putting the rate up, I've had people talk to me, Sakura coming off patent, we should go out and put out 160 grams because it'll get better ryegrass control. And I'm going, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that because, one, you're not going to grow canola next year. Two, you're not going to grow oats for at least 3 years after that. You're going to you're probably not even going to grow barley if it's dry. You're likely to increase residues in grain, and you'll get a much better job if you save the money and put it into Avadex and do Sakura Avadex instead. Okay? So, any temptation to go over the label limit, to go late, put it on the wrong crop, you just got to resist that. They're the ones that are really going to get you into trouble.
Finally, just to wrap things up, because we need to go to morning tea, making decisions. Today's workshop, there's lots of things being discussed, but there is the importance of seeking individual advice unique to your circumstances. What's your tip there for listening to today?
Look, we have trained in South Australia, you know, a good set of quality agronomists. And in fact, I've taught a lot of them, so obviously they're good, because if I've taught them, the ones I haven't taught, Steve taught, so all the older ones Steve taught. But no, look, I think that, you know, agronomists can help you through those decision making. And I'm going to really put on the agronomists that I want them to make sure that they're up on what needs to be done around product stewardship. They need to know labels inside and out. They need to know that, you know, if it says coarse spray quality, you want to be absolutely coarse spray quality, if not coarser. They need to know that. And so I think that they can really help you. If you're a bit worried about, is it right for this sort of circumstance, your agronomist should be able to help you get that decision right. So I can see some of the younger agronomists that I've taught in recent years sitting down the front here, so they've all got some homework to do now.
Excellent. Well, we're going to draw that session to an end. Professor Chris Preston, thank you very much for the discussion and your presentation. Big round of applause. So we have morning tea now. A reminder not to drink the beers in the fridge. Morning tea is served down the back here. I will be calling you back at 11:20. And if you've got questions, can you bring them up to this table or I'll come around? And speakers, can I have you up here? Because we're going to have a look at the questions and make sure we address them. Thanks again, everyone. Have a nice break.